invited to speak here today, so thank you very much to Anna and Paula for inviting me. And it's with great enthusiasm that I see everyone coming together to talk about what I feel is a very important issue. And to see so much interest and excitement around global citizenship is very empowering in itself. I will start by saying that recent events have highlighted the importance of thinking about global citizenship and how we promote the ideals that it advocates. Just the last few weeks, we've had painful reminders of the threat of division, fragmentation, and hatred. We have had Brexit. We have had suicide bombings in Istanbul. And this is only part of a long list of events over the past few years that go against the very core ideal of global citizenship. And I think Rebecca has said something similar earlier, that we should not be complacent. There might be times when we think that global citizenship is just a given in a globalized world, that it's something that happens through mobility, through traveling, through further connections. But I think political movements, social division, and killings across the world warn us that this ideal of common belonging and shared humanity is one that needs to be constantly reaffirmed. And so I hope that today's conference and your engagement with the topic of global citizenship will be one of these reaffirmations. So my talk today is going to focus on global citizenship education with the subtitle The Power of Imagination, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But initially, I'm going to give an overview of the term global citizenship and global citizenship education and how it's conceptualized both in theory and practice. This is not an exhaustive overview, it's somewhat self-selective, but I hope that it can give some insights into both the definitions and the controversies around the concept and start these discussions and reflections on this. I'll then focus more specifically on the challenges that global citizenship education face, and again debates around this concept. And finally, I will move to imagination and give a more personal view. I felt that this was a forum to be a bit more exploratory, so this is what I'll be looking at to finish this talk, and thinking about the implications of imagination for global citizenship education. And I'm going to try to use this. Good, it works. Okay, we're fine. So a recent poll that was run by GlobeScan for the BBC and was released in April 2016 declared that, or showed in a way, that global citizenship is rising. And there were more than 20,000 people across 28 countries were asked the question, are you a global citizen? Now, the reason I've put this picture up is not because it's some excellent representation of data, but I thought if we could start with a picture of a globe, then we're getting into the theme. There are a lot of issues with this picture, but basically the findings showed that people do feel more and more like they are global citizens, but that there's a discrepancy between what they term developing economies or emerging economies and industrialized nations. Now, we could ask the question of how do we talk about global citizenship if it's put into all these different national categories, but it's interesting to think about the themes that have emerged in general media as well around the notion of global citizen, and this idea that actually it has become quite a mainstream term. Now, if we look at some of the results that have been reported, we have the first aspect is that national identity is still a very important part of being a global citizen, which might seem quite counterintuitive, but I'm sure some of you in the room are asking, where am I from, where's my accent from, and trying to fit these categories onto different people. So national identity, there's a tendency to say that there's been the erosion of national boundaries, that we now live in a global and interconnected world, but I think it's important not to forget how nationalism does still play out. And again, with recent events such as the Brexit referendum, this has been made even more, has become even more important, I think, or at least has been a reminder of how national identity still shapes people's beliefs. It implies an ease of communication and awareness of global issues. That also is linked to the rise of prosperity, mobility, and migration. That identities are complex and multiple. So although people might define themselves as global citizens, it's not a straightforward identity, and it needs to be negotiated with other types of identities. Now, the BBC gave two examples. One is a religious affiliation, and they cited that 2 in 5 Pakistanis self-identified as a member of their religion above anything else. And again, these are reported results that half of the Indonesians who took part in the poll felt that being part of the local community is more important than anything else. Now, there are a lot of criticisms that can be made to this poll, and in itself the concept of global citizenship is debatable, and the interpretation was open to the respondents. But it does give a sense of some of the issues that we'll be engaging with today, and some of the popularly held beliefs that we have around global citizenship. It also shows that there's not a unified definition, and that there are lots of different ways of looking at global citizenship, both in terms of the agendas that are set, but also across the world. So moving on to the question that we'll be addressing today in many different ways is, what is global citizenship? So in many cases, it's seen as a response to globalization, increased mobility, migration, the erosion of national boundaries. Nothing new here. It also emphasizes diversity and connections. We've said that already. Martha Nussbaum has been very influential in bringing the notion of empathy forward, and this idea of being able to understand what the lives of others are in order to connect to them and to empathize with them. And then Hans Schattel, who's written extensively about global citizenship, sees three strands of global citizenship, which he defines as awareness, participation, and responsibility. These are just some ideas, and we're going to come back to some of them throughout the talk as well. So we can see that there are common themes that emerge when we talk about global citizenship. One is, again, this idea of interconnectedness, multiple identities, the notion of inclusion, both in terms of humanity and the planet, thinking about the environment, and also this notion of civic engagement, which in a way acts as a link between the local and the global, where engagement with local communities also has an impact on, in terms of global communities and global responsibility. And this is inscribed within the wider framework of international human rights. Now, what is a global citizen? Oh, sorry, one slide before we do that. Global citizenship is also aspirational and ideational, and it aims to create new political possibilities. And this is something I'll be coming back to in a bit, but there's the idea that it's linked to survival and necessity. We need to find ways to live together in a sustainable way. And this has many implications, both in terms of thinking about the environment, in thinking about people, in thinking about building a more peaceful and tolerant society. And this requires engagement and imagination, and that is why today imagination will feature quite permanently in this talk. So I've asked this already, but again, what is a global citizen? So Hans Schattel identified from the literature 5 different types of global citizens, and I'm not going to go into great detail about it, but his first category that he identified from the literature are global cosmopolitans. And I'm sure many of you will identify to being a global cosmopolitan. It's people who have had high global mobility, have engaged with different cultures, might speak different languages, and there's a general ethos of belonging to the world, being a citizen of the world. Then we have, global activists, who are people who are actively engaged around issues such as the eradication of global poverty or human rights, the environment, and this might be at a local, national, or global level. But there's this idea again of responsibility towards other humans and towards the world. We have global reformers who advocate for more cohesive kind of overall framework for the world. And that means that they want more globally accountable governing institutions, and they want a system of world government that is more fair and more transparent. Global managers are very often individuals who work with the United Nations or other international governing institutions and engage in strong activism to resolve borderless problems that range from climate change to the threat of nuclear weapons, for example. And then we have global capitalists who are generally seen as multinational corporate executives, and we can see that this is a very different approach, but they're a type of denationalized global elite who are interested in developing developing a more integrated economy, but at times will be willing to assume heavy financial risks to develop global corporate interests. Now, Hans Schattel says that there is one category that is missing in this literature on global citizens, and that's the one that we're interested in today, which is global educators. And for Schattel, these include classroom teachers, lecturers, school principals, scholars with international credentials or contacts and research agendas, leaders of international exchange programs, or educational outreach coordinators for advocacy groups, for example. And we'll be coming back to these groups, but it's important to think about global educators as a very important category when thinking about global citizenship. And this is where global citizenship education holds a very central place. So we can see from this that we have the very different actors involved in global citizenship, but also different agendas. So the calls for global citizenship education emerge from a range of organizations. It can be intergovernmental bodies, national governments, NGOs, the media, and voluntary and business sectors. And because of these different actors, we very often have a range of agendas that at times might be quite contradictory. You can see here, we might have intercultural understanding, economic integration, skills and knowledge for the global economy, human rights, social justice and equality. It would be fantastic if they all work together towards the same goals, but very often there are contradictory discourses, and actually some of these goals can have negative effects on the others. So I'm going to turn now to what do we have in terms of global citizenship education in practice. And I'll just give two different examples of organizations, global organizations that work towards that. So first we have Oxfam, and Oxfam is very often cited as one of the definitions of what global citizenship is. So here you have the Oxfam definition of global citizenship. And for Oxfam, a global citizen is someone who is aware of the wider world and has a sense of their own role as a world citizen, respects and values diversity, has an understanding of how the world works, is outraged by social injustice, participates in the community at a range of levels, from the local to the global, and is willing to act to make the world a more equitable and sustainable place, and takes responsibility for their actions. Now, linked to this definition, which is very often cited both in the literature but also in debates around global citizenship, is the goals that Oxfam has for global citizenship education. I'm not going to read all of them as I just did for the definition, but we can see some themes that have already been evoked this morning and that you'll be very familiar with: the idea of critical thinking, challenging stereotypes, the notion of challenging inequalities, but also this idea of engagement through collective action. Now, moving on, we have UNESCO that has been very active as well in developing an international framework for global citizenship education. And here you have the definition by UNESCO of global citizenship, which is nurturing respect for all, building a sense of belonging to a common humanity, and helping learners become responsible and active global citizens. Now, you'll see that there's similar themes that keep coming up that can make us think about the way in which global citizenship is being framed in relationship to active engagement, for example, but also to what a global citizen is. The last point, which comes back with Oxfam as well and a lot of the literature, is that global citizenship education is for learners of all ages, and this includes children. There's not any time too young to be a global citizen, young people and adults. So it's a continuing process as well. Now, one of the really important achievements in relation to an international framework for global citizenship education is that global citizenship was integrated within the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals. And here we have the SVGs Target 4.7, which is by 2030 to ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and non-violence, global citizenship and appreciation of cultural diversity, and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. Now, I've read this out loud just for us to think a little bit about the way in which global citizenship has been included with sustainable development education. and that there are lots of different agendas here within one target. So you can see that global citizenship as well, global citizenship education, does not stand alone, but is very interconnected with other global goals as well. Now, how does UNESCO aim to reach these? We have 4 different areas of focus that UNESCO proposes. One is global advocacy and policy dialogue, and I think this is kind of a given when we think about global citizenship. But the other aspect that is often not that much mentioned when we think about global citizenship literature in the academic field is the notion of global measurement of progress on global citizenship and education for sustainable development. So we are in a time where standardization and measurement have become one of the kind of baselines for international programs or for international policy. And so this is something to think about as well when we think about global citizenship education, is the constraints that we're under as well. And how do we show policy returns when we have activists in the field? How can we show that global citizenship is happening? And that is something that is interesting to think about, even though it might embrace a discourse that is not always, doesn't always match the ethos of global citizenship. The other aspect is peace and human rights education. Obviously, the international human rights framework is very important. And then the last aspect, preventing violent extremism through education, has become one of the aspects that's very important when thinking about global citizenship education. And I'll come back to that in a little bit, but I think it's an interesting new shift as well in thinking about where is global citizenship education happening and how do we engage in this prevention of violent extremism? How do we get there? So if we look at the kind of, to summarize, do we have an international agenda for global citizenship education? There are kind of similar themes from Oxfam and UNESCO. One, and this will keep coming back, is emphasis on interconnectedness, a commitment to social justice, a holistic approach, the idea that education is not just in the classroom and the university, but involves all areas of formal, informal, non-formal education, and also the importance of engaging with controversial issues. There's also a kind of tension almost between values and activism. There's an ethos of care, there's an ethos of being committed to the idea of global citizenship, but there's also the need to be more than just an ideal, the idea to be engaged, to be activist, and to allow young people to develop forms of activism. And then we can also note a set of dualisms that emerge, and we'll see this again when I'm showing the literature, between the individual and the collective. It's about empowering the individual to be a global citizen. We talk a lot about identity, self-reflection, but how does this link to the collective? To both being a global citizen, but also to local group actions. Again, a dualism that we find constantly between the local and the global, but also this notion of universality and diversity. And we'll come back to that, because I think this points to some of the challenges that global citizenship education might face. So turning to more of the literature in the academic field, what are the debates around global citizenship education, or what are some of the main themes? Obviously, it's a really wide field. As we've seen, there's very different agendas and different actors, so it's impossible to give an entire summary. But here are some of the main ideas, or actually the ideas that interest me. So you might have some very different views, and again, that's what makes a forum like this very interesting. So one of the kind of rationale behind global citizenship education is not just the kind of ideal of making the world a better place, but also the realization that schools and educational institutions, universities, are part of global networks and flows of information, goods, and people, and that we need to reflect on that and see ways in which global citizenship can be integrated in education. Global citizenship education is also seen as a response to global trends, not only a response to global trends, but also global crisis. And Sharon Todd has been very influential in thinking about the idea that global citizenship isn't just a happy ideal. It's also facing not just the good of humanity, but the bad of humanity. And so she advocates very much for recognizing these crises and engaging with it. Now, very often, global citizenship and cosmopolitanism can be used interchangeably, and we often have in the literature cosmopolitan citizenship as a corollary to global citizenship. They don't mean the same thing exactly, but they do. There are many points of interconnection. Martha Nussbaum, who's developed a Stoic cosmopolitan philosophy in a way to think about education in a world of, in an era of global connections, says that cosmopolitanism is made of global identities, attachments, and commitments. She emphasizes, as I said earlier, empathetic connections to others and insists on the need to cultivate shared humanity. Delanty, who's a sociologist, insists on the way in which cosmopolitan citizenship can emphasize common experiences, learning processes, but also discourses of empowerment that make possible immanent transcendence. And by that he means overcoming national boundaries and finding ways to empower minorities who might not be represented at a national level. Now, global citizenship education faces many challenges that are very linked to global citizenship itself. One of them is that there are multiple definitions, but also there's the question, and these have been raised already in the introduction, which is, does global citizenship education engage with global inequalities, or is it favoring global consumers? Now, this notion of mobility in higher education, for example, has been criticized by people such as Rother Lewin for promoting more global consumers of education who come or promoting academic tourism in a way, rather than forming global citizens. Now, I'm sure many of you would disagree, and this is a very, quite a biased view, but it does raise questions of what are global citizenship education programs doing, and how in a way can we reconcile these two aspects? Because you don't have to be, have these dualisms between an active, engaged global citizen and a global consumer. There's also the question of how does global citizenship relate to national frameworks? And also, we've mentioned the problematic notion of culture, but what is the relationship to culture? And these are tensions that are very real in thinking about global citizenship, that we don't just eradicate national frameworks. We do still all function in national frameworks very often. And then culture as well. Every form of global citizenship is culturally situated. So these are aspects that we need to think about as well. And this raises the question of what structural framework do we need to have for global citizenship education? What is the relationship of global citizenship education with an international human rights framework? And more importantly, how do we give young people or young global citizens the tools to be able to understand an international human rights framework? Do we need legal knowledge? How do young people engage with these frameworks that are put here as as a symbol of global citizenship in a way? And so Lynn Davis asked a question which I think is very important. Is global citizenship education a mere abstraction, or is it a framework for action? Now, her response to this is that we need to think of global citizenship education in terms of critical engagement. And for her, global citizenship implies active engagement. It's important to promote active citizens through the experience of school democracy and involvement in community service. So she writes from the view of secondary school, but I think this is very relevant for higher education as well, which is how do we bridge this difference between the abstraction and actually being involved. She also argues that empathy is not enough. There must be outrage so that motivations for change are high. Understanding the life or the difficulties of others is not enough if we are not committed to that change. She also argues that we do need legal knowledge to exert rights, responsibilities, and actions, and that presenting these words or these concepts is not enough. People need the tools to be actively engaged and to understand these rights and responsibilities. And then Davis and Pikes insist on going beyond rhetoric to reality and recognizing the importance of process. Global citizenship is not something that's acquired and that people then have. It's a constant process. As I said earlier, it is something that needs to be constantly reaffirmed. And so it's a lifelong engagement and journey in a way to continue to be a global citizen. Other aspects that Lynn Davis suggests is to pay attention to the distinctions between the public and the private sphere. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. But also engage with controversial issues, which I mentioned before, and deal with disagreement. Now that can be something that's very uncomfortable, and being able to find comfort with uncertainty and fluidity and the fact that not everyone is going to speak in a united voice is very important in terms of thinking about global citizenship education programs. And she suggests that we need to act local, analyze national, and think global. So it's no longer just a local, global relationship, but we also need to have the tools to engage with what is around us in order to create a higher ideal of global citizenship. Now, moving on quite quickly to some different views in the literature, I've mentioned Martha Nussbaum already. In her book, Cultivating Humanity, she suggests 3 capacities that for global citizenship education. The first is the capacity for critical examination, and that is being able to put your own beliefs back in question, but also to be able to have the tools to understand an argument, to engage in a debate, and to then make up your opinion on these arguments, but also being able to make your argument clearly. And this, she says, is one of the important roles that universities have. The other aspect, we've mentioned this many times, it keeps coming back, but it's important, empathy towards others. And for her, this is fundamental to having ties between human beings. And this is not just kind of feeling towards the others, but also having knowledge of different perspectives through interdisciplinarity. So we have, it's great to have a conference like today, which favors interdisciplinarity, but being able to look at these different perspectives is a first step towards developing empathy. And finally, the aspect that interests me, for the final part of my talk, and I'll come back to it in a little bit, is to develop narrative imagination. And according to Nussbaum, students cannot become cosmopolitan citizens based on facts alone. They need to be able to imagine what life is like for other people. They need to be able to think of different realities. And this is why imagination plays an important role as well. Now, these views are all very empowering and they're all very exciting, but they have been criticized as well. And in particular, there's been a call for decolonizing global citizenship education. Views such as Martha Nussbaum, this idea of interconnectedness, have been criticized by a group of scholars, and here we have Andreotti, Todd, and Rizvi, who've been quite vocal in critiquing global citizenship education, and in particular, the universalist and normative assumptions of global citizenship education, which they equate to Western values and neo-colonialism. The other criticism has been that very often global citizenship agenda have been instrumentalized, and that actually they still fit within a very neoliberal discourse which favors standards, testing, and skills for the economy. And so Harriet Marshall, who's written extensively about global citizenship education from a global Southern perspective, speaks about the importance to think about the cultural situatedness of global citizenship. In particular, to think about the particular historical, social, political, and cultural context in which it emerged. And in order to be active global citizens, she argues that we need to know where these discourses are coming from. Another question is around language and this idea of English as a lingua franca. Now, it's an area that interests me a lot, and I would talk about it longer, but we can have questions about it later. But there are, again, tensions. It's not just a straightforward idea that because we're all speaking English, it is a hegemony of English language. Jens Blommert, who's a social linguist, talks about the opportunities that English might afford as well. And then it's not just a straightforward domination of English, it's also allowing people to engage in global dialogues, to be involved in the global economy. So it's not a straightforward answer either, but it is interesting to think about these questions. So we can see that there are multiple tensions when thinking about global citizenship education. One is that there are so many conceptions of global citizenship education, and sometimes they are in such contradictory discourses of how do we manage to work, to navigate the very complex field of global citizenship education and the different imperatives. I think that we also need to be reminded of the unequal power relations and hierarchies. Most of us are aware of those, but how do we actively engage with them without just paying lip service to the fact that we know they exist? And there's a whole set of dual oppositions that we kind of emerge both in practice and in theory around global citizenship education. And here are just some of the ideas. I won't go through all of them. But we can see that, for example, there's a tension between tolerance and critical debate, or being oppressive versus emancipatory. And my argument in the final part of this talk is that there isn't a need for these to be constantly in contradiction or in dual oppositions. And one of the ways that I see, and this is where we move to my more personal views, and I'm very happy to hear people disagree with it as well, my view is that we need to reclaim imagination. Now the problem with the notion of imagination in academia is that it can seem a bit, at best, a bit airy-fairy, or this kind of academic in the ivory tower, or at worst it might be just reciting the lyrics from a song by John Lennon. And so I think there is some basis for thinking about imagination that goes beyond kind of just a very inspiring song. So within the literature, imagination has been seen as a very important concept for thinking about the global. And in particular, it's been seen by thinkers such as Appadurai, or Faisal Rizvi, or Kelly Burns, as a social practice, which actually opens up new forms of dialogue or mediation between individuals or between minorities, and what Appadurai calls globally defined fields of possibility. So new pathways for dialogue are opened through imagination, and I'll unpack that a little bit right now. Faisal Rizvi says that we actually need a more critical global imagination in global citizenship education, and this is coming from a decolonizing point of view on global education, but he argues that imagination is a way of shifting the general discourses. And then Delante sees cosmopolitan imagination as a normative critique of globalization. So again, it's not just about thinking happy thoughts and imagining a better world, it's actually actively engaging with the notion of global citizenship. Again, we're back to Nussbaum, who seems to be everywhere when we talk about global citizenship, but she argues that narrative imagination is important for thinking about global citizenship. Kwame Appiah sees sympathetic imagination, which resembles a little bit Nussbaum's idea, as a fundamental characteristic to favor coexistence, dialogue, and conversation in human community. Maxim Green, who thought a lot about multiculturalism and pluralism, shows how imagination is the key to looking through different perspectives and to sharing people's different experiences. But she also argues that imagination, art, and metaphor can open dialogue and offers hope for the possibility of change. And this is a view that's echoed by Alison Phipps in the intercultural kind of studies, in talking about the way in which aesthetics and poetics can help change our ways of thinking about global citizenship. And now my view, in my own research, is very much inspired by the work of Paul Ricoeur, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because we're running out of time, but I'm happy to talk about it later. And so my argument is that we need to think about global imaginaries when we're thinking about global citizenship education. And this is based on a dialectic between ideology and utopia, which was developed by Paul Ricoeur, and the idea that ideology, the kind of forms of false consciousness or political oppression that we might experience, that create kind of a sense of collective belonging and symbols, always goes hand in hand with utopia. They're not separate, they're not antagonistic, they are mutually constitutive. And utopia is what opens up to future possibilities. So based on this, I was interested in my own research in looking about the views of young immigrants in France and England and their views about themselves and how they belong to the world. Now, I don't have time to give too many details about that, but I'm just going to show you a few vignettes of young children and how they define how their global imaginaries can help us think about global citizenship education. So here we have the diary of a young girl of Hmong background, which is an ethnic minority in Laos, and her parents had moved to France when she was very young. And she operates a form of joint cultural creation. This is an extract from her diary, which I'll read to you. I'll read a bit. She says, "In singing, I share with Farida, whose family is from Morocco. Her and me, we like to sing. We compose songs. We sing all the time, even at school. Her and me, when we sing, we feel things. The songs that we compose, it's for a reason. We try to convey a message and share. For Farida, her passion is singing, and I sing with her because she shared her passion with me. She sings a bit in Arabic, and I sing in Hmong. It's very pretty. In her songs, she speaks to me, and I answer her. But I know that her passion is singing." Now, there are a lot of themes that come through here, and unfortunately, I don't have that much time to kind of talk about this. But this notion, first of all, is a kind of bilingual, multilingual dialogue happening. There's the idea of sharing and feeling things together, which links to empathy. And there's also the idea that it's for a reason, that we try to convey messages. These two girls were 11, but we can already see a sense of social or global responsibility that goes with that. Sorry, this sounds a little bit weird. Now, Marine also shows this global connection and responsibilities in this slight graphic novel that she developed in her diary. And this is written in French, but I'll translate it for you. So she says, in Laos, we are all unhappy. Their parents are dead. Her mother wants to make him happy. They have no more money to feed the child. And this was her perception of the country that her parents came from, to which she felt very attached. And this is just the last example about these global connections, but also sense of responsibilities that here start at a young age. And so she talks about people from Laos, the Hmongs, and she says they managed to leave Laos to come to the four corners of the world. But for them, the little Hmong children in Laos, they are happy. At least they laugh sometimes. They don't just cry. I looked on internet to see all the people who tell their stories. They cry. There are thousands of Hmong calling for help. But no one intervenes. A few people, but they don't have the power to help them. That's why my cousins want to go to school, for that, to try to do good studies for that. So it's very interesting how learning, how empowerment comes from going to school to be able to give back to the Hmong community, this sense of connection, of global connection, but also the way in which she found information through technology. So there's a lot more that could be said about that, but this was just a quick vignette to show the way in which imagination enables these new links and this sense of engagement as well with others. I'm going to quickly finish off now and just show you very briefly some maps from the children in which they saw themselves as belonging to different countries of the world. Here are some children from North Africa who live in France, but they saw their future as being in the US. So again, it buys into many different discourses. Here we have, the three first maps are young Muslim girls from Bangladesh who live in England and who saw religious affiliation as also being very important in terms of the important countries in the world. And then finally, here we have Eheb, who was from Algeria, who was born in Algeria but moved when he was 1, and who drew an Algerian flag in France and a French flag in Algeria. And when he showed it to me, he said, this is because I speak French in Algeria and Algerian in French. So it's interesting in thinking about the way in which we can transcend normative categories as well, and these possibilities of reimagination. I'm going to skip this on mobility, but I'm also going to show the less happy side of global imagination. And here we have Akil, who's a family's from Bangladesh, and he speaks about his feeling of generalized Islamophobia and the fear of having people in a man called Pastor Jones in New York wanting to burn the Quran. And here we have Eheb again, whose map I just showed you, who says that he might be deported from France if he doesn't work well at school. So global imaginaries can both be, and I'll skip these, can both be emancipatory, but also they can also be quite alienating. And I think the notion of imagination shows that these two work hand in hand, and when we're thinking about global citizenship education, we need to think about both the empowering dimension, but also the alienating side. And the fact that sometimes we can be, people can be victims of what Lauren Berlant calls cruel optimism. The idea that, yes, we have all these empowering messages and this idea of global citizenship, but that this might not be within the reach of most of the population. These children came from very socially disadvantaged backgrounds. They had the imagination to belong to the world, but whether their situation and their situated life experience will allow them that is a different question. So I think these are things to be reminded of when we think about global citizenship education. Now, to conclude, here are just a few points that I'd like to make to think about global citizenship education. These are just personal views, and they need to be developed and challenged, so I'm happy to hear your comments on this as well. So what do we need? The first thing we need, I'd say, is literacy. And by this I don't mean just being able to read, but all forms of literacy: textual, visual, and statistical literacy. There have been long-standing debates about the difference between knowledge and skills, but I find that in global education programs we insist very much on critical skills and the skills to participate in a global society. But I think that knowledge as well needs to be reinforced, and the two needs to go hand in hand. And in order to kind of question different forms of media, different visual, statistical representations, we need to develop this literacy throughout all ages in order to question what is in the media, to question forms of political fear-mongering, and also to imagine new ways in which to emphasize shared humanity. The next point is awareness and reflection, and I've taken away the notion of self-reflection, not because I don't think it's important, but because I think there's an overemphasis sometimes on thinking about oneself and where we stand in the world, and I think reflection can be individual and collective. The idea is to be able to know where you stand as a global citizen. Now this year I personally, and I'm going to go into self-reflection now, have been quite challenged in my identity as a global citizen. I have 3 nationalities, I speak 3 languages, I've lived in 5 different countries, and there was no question for me working in an international environment that yes, I am a global citizen. I grew up in France, and I have to say, when the Paris attacks happened in November, I was touched in a very different way than I had been from many other attacks across the world. And it's not a comfortable situation to be in. It's an embarrassing and even shameful position to be in, to think, well, do these lives matter more? Of course not. But there's something about our own situatedness, and that different events might not affect us differently. And so when we're thinking about global citizenship, there's also how we relate to the world, and how emotions can also give you different points of view. The next point is recognition. And for this I turn again to Paul Ricoeur. It's not just recognition of others in a simple way, but he, in his book, which is called On Recognition, argues that recognition is essential for thinking about the other. It doesn't imply labeling the other, but it is a process of mutual recognition, to recognize someone as other, as different, not just because it is not you, but also to be recognized by the other. And this is in a way, a journey, it's a movement, and it's a way of discovering the other. It's a trajectory, it goes through memory and recognition through promise, but also it's the recognition of what happens between people. And it's the in-betweenness that is very important to think about global citizenship and how we relate to others, not in a labeling of them versus us, but in a dynamic that allows you to really engage with the other. And this goes back to the notion of inter, the Latin root, and it comes back to the fourth idea that I have on transcendence. And this is the idea of inter. It can be international, interculturality, interdisciplinarity, but this idea of in-between. The fact that we cross boundaries, we transcend boundaries, and we need to challenge static forms of categorization, which very often result in a them versus us or an either or. Crossing boundaries is not just the disruption or uncertainty. It can be a way of living, and it can be a way of imagining life as interconnected rather than divided. This also implies crossing boundaries between the public and the private, the political and the personal, the cognitive and the affective. This appeals to the holistic aspect of global citizenship, and it shouldn't be dismissed. I think there's a tendency to think of citizenship in the public sphere, but the interplay between the two is very important as well. The emotions we might have as global citizens are just as important as the political stances we take. Now, there's a famous feminist phrase by Carol Hanisch, which is the personal is political, and I'd like to reverse that as well by saying the political is personal, and that seeing how people's lives are affected as well as how our activism is affected is very important. Almost there. The second to last point is resilience. Resilience has become rather popular in certain fields, and it runs the risk of being used lightly, but I think it's extremely important in terms of thinking of global citizenship. In times of peace and prosperity, the ideals of global citizenship can appear quite easy to reach. But in times of conflict, in times of division, of pain, of fear, of hatred, these ideals might be much harder to sustain. And I think this is where resilience is needed. It's understood as the capacity to withstand or endure challenges and to recover from them. Resilience is needed at a time of disaster, but it's also needed in times of change, in times of risk, and in times marked by anxiety and fear, as many people experience right now. People need to be given the tools to endure and overcome setbacks or hardships, but also to continue to believe in the possibility of change and overcome forms of division or finger-pointing in blaming the other for things that are going wrong. It's something that is dynamic, it includes memory, it includes thinking about the future, but I think it also empowers people to reimagine society, to reimagine the world, to think about a different future, and to overcome some forms of disappointment or pain that we might have experienced both politically and personally. And this allows what Alison Phipps calls wonder and re-enchantment when thinking about the world. And to finish, I think we need hope. Now this might seem a little bit naive, but naivety is also seen as a force for creativity and the idea of looking at things as if we saw them for the first time. We tend to be in an era when we were post everything, and so where do we go? And I think there's a need to reclaim hope. How do we get actively engaged? How do we take part in this global citizenship project without the belief in the possibility of change? And for this, we need wide horizons. We need to imagine alternative realities, and we need hope. Sorry, I lost my last bit, but I will. Here we are. And hope, as I said, is what creates new horizons and possibilities. Hannah Arendt, in her collection of essays, Men in Dark Times, insisted on the way in which, even in the darkest times, and she's talking of the horrors of the 20th century, some people's lives and actions still offered a flickering light, an illumination against this darkness. And I quote Arendt now. She says, even in the darkest of times, we have the right to expect some illumination, and that such illumination may come less from theories and concepts than from the uncertain, flickering, and often weak light that some men and women in their lives and works will kindle under almost all circumstances and shed over the time span that was given them on earth. So to conclude, I'd say that beyond the many political, economic, and social reasons for global citizenship education, I believe that more than ever this is a time when common belonging needs to be embraced and supported. In a time of uncertainty, doubt, and anguish, we do not need further division, isolation, and closed doors. We need this sense of interconnectedness, of shared humanity, and love. And I'm sure all of you will agree that global citizenship education has much to contribute. But more than anything, it holds promises for the future. It offers the possibility of building a politics of hope and keeping, as Arendt put it, some illumination in dark times. So on these words, I wish you a wonderful, challenging, and hopeful conference, and I look forward to the discussions to follow. Thank you.